Picture this scenario. You're sound asleep in your own bed when suddenly federal agents burst through your front door, tossing in a stun grenade, dragging you outside in handcuffs, and pointing weapons at your spouse. The shocking part? They raided the completely wrong address. Even more disturbing, when you attempt to seek justice for this terrifying mistake, the government tells you that you have no right to sue them and they bear no responsibility for what happened. This isn't some fictional story. This actually occurred, and the case went all the way to the highest court in our nation. The Supreme Court delivered a decision that every American needs to know about, ruling unanimously with all 9 justices in favor of the innocent family who suffered this nightmare. This landmark case is officially known as Martin versus the United States, and it centers on events that unfolded in a quiet neighborhood outside Atlanta back in 2017. What makes this case particularly significant is how it addresses the fundamental question of whether ordinary citizens can hold federal agents responsible when they make serious mistakes, or whether the government can simply walk away without facing any consequences for their errors. The Supreme Court's decision has major implications for all Americans, especially those who value their constitutional rights and believe in accountability for law enforcement at every level. Before we get into the details, I need you to do something really quick. Smash that like button right now if you care about protecting your Second Amendment rights. It only takes a second, and it makes a huge difference in getting this information out to more people who need it. Also, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future updates on your rights. Trust me, you're going to want to stay informed about this stuff. Now let me walk you through exactly what happened to this family. The Federal Bureau of Investigation planned a raid targeting suspected gang members at a specific location. Special Agent Lawrence Guerrera was put in charge of leading this early morning operation. The agency had identified the correct target address where they believed these suspects were located. However, instead of following standard procedures and going directly to that authorized location, the agent made a critical decision. He chose to use his personal navigation system, most likely the GPS function on his personal phone, to find the address. When he entered the address into his personal device, something went terribly wrong. The GPS system directed him to an entirely different home. This wasn't the house where any criminals were hiding. This was the residence of Katrina Martin, who lived there with her boyfriend and their young son, who was only 7 years old at the time. This family had absolutely nothing to do with gangs or any criminal activity whatsoever. They were innocent people living their normal lives, completely unaware that their world was about to be turned upside down. When the FBI team arrived at the Martin home in those early morning hours, they didn't knock politely or announce themselves clearly. Instead, they used extreme force to enter the residence. They broke down the front door without any warning to the people inside. Then they set off flashbang devices, which are explosive stun grenades designed to disorient people with blinding light and deafening noise. Inside the home, the boyfriend had apparently taken cover in a closet, possibly thinking there was a break-in happening. The agents found him there and immediately placed him in handcuffs. They also confronted Katrina Martin, who was barely clothed at the time, having been asleep in her own home. They held her at gunpoint while she was in this vulnerable state. Even the young child was pulled from the home during this terrifying raid. After the agents had forcibly detained every member of the household and secured them outside, they began searching through the residence looking for the suspects and evidence they expected to find. During this search, one of the agents happened to notice some pieces of mail sitting on a coffee table in the living room. When he looked at the address printed on that mail, he realized immediately that something was very wrong. The address on the mail did not match the address they were supposed to be raiding. At that moment, the awful truth became clear to everyone involved. The FBI had just conducted a violent, terrifying raid on completely innocent people. They had stormed the wrong house. You can imagine the sinking feeling those agents must have experienced when they realized the magnitude of their error. Following this traumatic and wrongful raid, the Martin family decided to take legal action. They filed a lawsuit against the FBI seeking compensation and accountability for what had been done to them. Their legal claim was brought under something called the Federal Tort Claims Act. This particular law is quite important because it creates one of the few pathways that allow regular American citizens to sue the federal government when federal employees do something wrong while performing their official duties. Under normal circumstances, the government enjoys broad protection from lawsuits through various forms of immunity, including something called qualified immunity. These protections typically shield government agencies and their employees from being sued for their actions. However, the Federal Tort Claims Act represents a specific exception to these protections. Through this law, the government has essentially agreed to allow citizens to bring certain types of legal claims when federal workers cause harm while doing their jobs. But even this law comes with its own set of limitations. There's actually a lengthy list of exceptions built into the Federal Tort Claims Act that specify situations where you still cannot sue the federal government, even under this more permissive framework. Two of these exceptions became the central focus of the Martin case. The first exception is referred to as the intentional tort exception. This provision states that you generally cannot sue the federal government for deliberate wrongful acts such as assault, battery, false arrest, or malicious prosecution. The second exception is called the discretionary function exception. This one shields the government from liability when the harmful actions resulted from an official making a discretionary decision. In other words, if the decision involved judgment, personal choice, or policy considerations, the government argues it should be protected from lawsuits arising from that decision. When the Martin family attempted to pursue their lawsuit under the Federal Tort Claims Act, the government immediately fought back by claiming protection under these exceptions. Specifically, the FBI argued that the agent's decision to use his personal GPS system fell under the discretionary function exception. Their argument was that choosing which navigation tool to use represented a discretionary choice made by the agent, and therefore he should still be immune from any legal consequences. According to the government's position, because the agent exercised his judgment in deciding how to locate the target address, any mistakes that flowed from that judgment were protected from lawsuits. The family initially filed their case in a federal district court located in Georgia. The government's lawyers quickly moved to have the entire case thrown out, arguing that both the intentional tort exception and the discretionary function exception prevented this type of lawsuit from going forward. The district court judge reviewed the arguments and sided with the federal government and the FBI. The judge dismissed the family's case. Not willing to give up on seeking justice, the family appealed this decision to the next level of federal courts. Their case went to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers federal cases from Georgia and several other southeastern states. Unfortunately for the Martin family, the 11th Circuit also ruled in favor of the FBI. The appeals court upheld the lower court's decision to dismiss the case. At this point, the family had lost at 2 levels of federal courts. However, they had one more option available to them. They could petition the Supreme Court of the United States to review their case. In our legal system, the Supreme Court doesn't automatically hear every case that comes before it. Instead, parties must file what's called a petition for certiorari, essentially asking the court to agree to review the case. The Supreme Court receives thousands of these petitions every year, but only agrees to hear a small fraction of them. The Martin family filed their petition, and remarkably, the Supreme Court agreed to take the case. This meant that 9 Supreme Court justices would review what had happened and decide whether the lower courts had gotten it right or wrong. When the Supreme Court finally issued its decision in this case, the result was extraordinary. All 9 justices agreed on the outcome. In today's often divided Supreme Court, unanimous decisions are relatively uncommon, which makes this 9-0 ruling particularly noteworthy. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote the court's opinion explaining their reasoning. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Martin family. They vacated the decision that the 11th Circuit had made, which means they essentially erased that ruling and said it was wrong. They then sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit with instructions to review it again in light of what the Supreme Court had explained. The Supreme Court's key finding addressed a technical but important legal question about how these exceptions to the Federal Tort Claims Act work together. They held that the law enforcement proviso, which is a specific provision in the law, only modifies the intentional tort exception. It doesn't create some kind of blanket immunity that overrides all the other exceptions in the statute. This might sound like legal technicalities, but the practical impact is significant. The lower courts had been applying these immunity protections too broadly, essentially creating a catch-all protection that prevented families like the Martins from ever getting their day in court. The Supreme Court found this approach to be incorrect based on what the law actually says. Because of this error in legal reasoning, the Supreme Court vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and sent the case back for reconsideration. Recently, the 11th Circuit has ordered the federal government to file what's called a supplemental brief. This is an additional legal document that explains how the Supreme Court's new ruling should affect this specific case going forward. The Department of Justice requested and received an extension of time to file this required brief. They currently have until November 21st to submit their response. The government's lawyers argued that they needed this extra time because of a government shutdown that was occurring, which they claimed prevented them from working on the case during that period. Regardless of these delays, eventually the federal government will have to respond to the Supreme Court's ruling. They will need to present new arguments at the 11th Circuit level, and the appeals court will have to reconsider the case based on the legal principles that the Supreme Court established. This means the Martin family's case is far from over, but they've won a crucial victory in having the Supreme Court say that they deserve to have their claims properly heard and evaluated. If the government can hide behind claims of discretion and immunity every single time something goes wrong, there's no real accountability in the system. Federal agencies face no consequences for their errors, and individual agents know they likely won't be held responsible for even serious mistakes. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Martin case helps narrow the government's ability to avoid lawsuits by claiming overly broad immunity protections. It reinforces the principle that federal agents should be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse the powers entrusted to them by the American people. This unanimous decision from all 9 Supreme Court justices sends a powerful message about the importance of government accountability. The case now returns to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, where judges will need to reconsider it based on the Supreme Court's guidance. The court has ordered the Department of Justice to file a new brief addressing how the Supreme Court's ruling applies to the Martin family's specific situation. Although the government managed to delay this filing because of the shutdown, they will ultimately have to respond, and the case will move forward. This Supreme Court decision represents an important development in protecting citizens' rights against government overreach and mistakes. It affirms that when federal agents make errors that harm innocent people, those citizens should have a meaningful opportunity to seek justice through the courts rather than being blocked by blanket immunity claims. For the Martin family, who endured a terrifying raid on their home, this ruling provides hope that they may finally receive acknowledgement of the wrong done to them and potentially compensation for their ordeal. For all Americans, it reinforces that government power must come with accountability and that our legal system should provide remedies when that power is misused. If you found this information valuable, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It helps get this critical information in front of more gun owners who need to know about these changes. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update on your rights. Share this video with every gun owner you know because this information is too important to keep to yourself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.